March 23, 1945. 2:14 a.m. The War Cabinet Rooms beneath Whitehall, London. Winston Churchill stood before the illuminated map of Germany, a fresh cigar clenched between his teeth, staring at the blue pin that marked Oppenheim and the Rhine River crossing that should not have existed yet, his face a thundercloud of emotions so complex and contradictory that even his closest aides kept their distance, understanding that the Prime Minister was processing news that had arrived by secure telegram 30 minutes earlier and that whatever reaction was building inside that brilliant, temperamental mind had not yet fully formed. General George S. Patton Jr., commanding the United States Third Army, had crossed the Rhine the previous evening without the massive artillery preparation, without the elaborate air support, without the careful coordination with Field Marshal Montgomery's meticulously planned assault to the north that was supposed to be the main effort, the grand set-piece operation that would carry the Allies across Germany's last great natural barrier and into the heart of the Reich. Patton had simply found a weakly defended sector, had thrown his forces across the river with minimal casualties, and had presented Supreme Headquarters and the entire Allied command structure with a fait accompli that was simultaneously a brilliant tactical coup and an act of operational insubordination so brazen that it threatened to undermine the entire framework of coalition warfare that Churchill had spent years constructing and maintaining. What Churchill really thought in that moment, standing alone in the subterranean command center while London slept above him and the fate of nations hung on decisions being made in the pre-dawn darkness, was far more complicated than simple approval or condemnation, and would illuminate fundamental tensions in the Anglo-American alliance that had been building since the Normandy landings and that would shape the post-war world in ways that neither Churchill nor Patton could fully anticipate. The relationship between Churchill and Patton had always been more theoretical than personal, mediated through official channels and filtered through the complex hierarchy of Allied command rather than built on direct interaction or mutual understanding. They had met only a handful of times, brief encounters at conferences or ceremonial occasions where protocol and public presentation had been more important than substantive conversation. But Churchill had been watching Patton's career with the careful attention he gave to all significant military commanders, had read reports of his campaigns in North Africa and Sicily and France, and had formed opinions about the American general that were characteristically nuanced and politically informed rather than based purely on military assessment. Churchill appreciated aggressive commanders in principle, understood the value of audacity in warfare, and recognized that breakthrough operations sometimes required the kind of relentless forward momentum that Patton embodied. The Prime Minister himself had been a cavalry officer in his youth, had experienced combat in multiple colonial wars, and retained a romantic attachment to the bold gesture and the decisive stroke that his more cautious military advisors sometimes found exasperating. In Patton's drive across France after the Normandy breakout, Churchill had seen echoes of the kind of warfare that he instinctively understood: rapid exploitation of enemy weakness, maintenance of initiative, refusal to allow the enemy time to recover or establish new defensive positions. But Churchill also understood coalition politics in ways that Patton either could not or would not grasp, understood that maintaining Allied unity required compromises and consultations and a willingness to subordinate individual brilliance to collective coordination. The Anglo-American alliance had been Churchill's greatest strategic achievement, the relationship with Roosevelt that had brought American power into the war against Hitler and had made possible the liberation of Western Europe. That alliance was built on carefully negotiated agreements about command structures and areas of responsibility, on British and American commanders working together within a framework that acknowledged both nations' contributions and interests, and on preventing the kind of national rivalry that had poisoned Allied cooperation during the First World War. Montgomery's planned Rhine crossing, Operation Plunder, had been conceived as a massive Anglo-Canadian operation that would demonstrate British military capability and would ensure that Britain maintained a prominent role in the final defeat of Germany even as American manpower and resources increasingly dominated Allied operations. Churchill had invested considerable political capital in ensuring Montgomery retained operational command of this crucial phase, had negotiated with Eisenhower and the American Joint Chiefs of Staff to prevent what he saw as premature transition to purely American command of Allied ground forces, and had viewed plunder as essential not just militarily but politically as a demonstration that Britain remained a significant military power whose contributions and leadership were indispensable to victory. Patton's unauthorized crossing at Oppenheim, achieved with a fraction of the casualties that Montgomery's elaborately prepared assault would likely suffer, threatened to make Operation Plunder look ponderous and overcautious by comparison, threatened to shift credit for crossing the Rhine from British planning and preparation to American opportunism and speed, and threatened to provide ammunition to those in Washington and in the American military who argued that British commanders were too slow and too concerned with casualties to prosecute the war with the aggression necessary to end it quickly. The telegram that had arrived at the War Cabinet had been terse and factual, reporting that elements of Third Army had crossed the Rhine near Oppenheim on the evening of March 22, that resistance had been light, that bridgeheads were being expanded, and that Patton had accomplished this without the kind of advance notification to SAGEF or coordination with adjacent forces that standing orders explicitly required. The message had been drafted by staff officers at Supreme Headquarters who understood that Churchill needed to be informed immediately but who had left the interpretation and implications for him to determine. Churchill had read the telegram twice, had set it down on the map table, and had then stood silently contemplating the illuminated map that showed Allied dispositions across the Rhine front. The blue pins representing Third Army's positions had not yet been moved to reflect the crossing because the information was too new and because the staff officers who maintained the map worked on regular schedules that did not accommodate dramatic developments in the middle of the night. The river itself was marked by a thick blue line that ran from Switzerland to the Netherlands, the last great natural barrier protecting Germany's industrial heartland, the objective that Allied planners had been working toward since the Normandy landings 10 months earlier. Churchill's mind had been working through layers of reaction and calculation with the speed and complexity that had made him one of history's great strategic thinkers. His immediate emotional response had been grudging admiration for Patton's audacity. It had been a brilliant tactical move, seizing an opportunity that more cautious commanders would have reported up the chain of command and waited for permission to exploit, by which time German forces would have reinforced the sector and the opportunity would have been lost. Churchill understood warfare well enough to recognize that Patton had probably saved American lives by crossing when and where he did. That the element of surprise and the weakness of German defenses in that sector had created conditions that would never be so favorable again. But this admiration had been immediately complicated by political and strategic concerns that had nothing to do with tactical brilliance and everything to do with maintaining the fragile coalition that was winning the war. Montgomery was going to be absolutely furious when he learned that Patton had upstaged his carefully planned operation, was going to interpret this as American disrespect for British command authority and possibly as deliberate sabotage of his Rhine crossing, and was going to demand explanations and assurances that Churchill would have difficulty providing. Monty's ego was legendary and his prickliness about command prerogatives was one of Churchill's recurring management challenges, and this incident would trigger exactly the kind of Anglo-American tension that the Prime Minister had been working to prevent or at least minimize. More broadly, Patton's action illustrated the fundamental shift in power dynamics within the Anglo-American alliance that Churchill had been fighting to slow or resist. American forces now vastly outnumbered British forces in Western Europe. American industrial production was supplying the majority of equipment and supplies, and American commanders were increasingly impatient with what they saw as British caution and British insistence on maintaining command authority that was no longer supported by military reality. Eisenhower was under pressure from Washington and from his own field commanders to assert more direct American control over operations, and incidents like Patton's Rhine crossing provided ammunition for those arguing that American forces should operate independently rather than remain subordinate to coalition command structures that gave Britain disproportionate influence. Churchill had lit his cigar methodically, the ritual of preparing and lighting the tobacco, giving him time to organize his thoughts and emotional reactions into a coherent response. He had understood that his reaction needed to be carefully calibrated, that it would be interpreted not just as personal opinion but as British government policy, and that it would influence how Eisenhower and the American command handled Patton and whether the incident became a source of alliance friction or could be managed as a tactical success that did not undermine strategic coordination. His first instinct had been to contact Eisenhower directly, to discuss the situation with the Supreme Commander before making any broader statements or taking any actions that could not be easily reversed. Churchill had maintained a careful relationship with Ike throughout the war, had recognized early that Eisenhower's greatest talent was coalition management rather than operational genius, and had generally supported the American general's leadership while gently pushing for British interests and perspectives when crucial decisions were being made. The secure telephone connection to SHAEF headquarters had been established within minutes, and Churchill had found himself speaking with Eisenhower's Chief of Staff, General Walter Bedell Smith, because Eisenhower himself was traveling between headquarters and was not immediately available. Smith had been professional and informative, had confirmed the basic facts of Patton's crossing, and had carefully avoided saying anything that would commit Eisenhower to a particular interpretation of events or response to Patton's actions before the Supreme Commander had a chance to assess the situation himself. Churchill had probed delicately for Smith's personal view of what had happened, and Smith had provided a response that was diplomatically bland but revealing in its implications. Third Army had acted within the general authority granted to subordinate commanders to exploit opportunities, had achieved significant tactical success, but had perhaps not provided the level of coordination and advance notification that proper procedure required. It had been the kind of answer that acknowledged the problem without defining it too sharply, that left room for multiple interpretations and responses, and that preserved Eisenhower's options for how to handle both Patton and the political complications the crossing had created. After concluding the call, Churchill had returned to studying the map, and his thoughts had turned to the broader strategic situation and how Patton's crossing fit into the final campaign against Germany. The war in Europe was entering its final phase, with Allied forces closing in from east and west on a German state that was clearly defeated but whose leadership showed no sign of seeking negotiated peace or surrender. Every week the war continued meant thousands more casualties, more destruction of German cities and infrastructure, and more time for the Soviets to advance westward and occupy territory that would shape the post-war settlement. From this perspective, anything that accelerated the final defeat of Germany was strategically valuable regardless of the procedural complications it created. Patton's crossing meant that Allied forces would be across the Rhine in force sooner than planned, would be able to begin the advance into Germany's heartland without waiting for Montgomery's elaborate preparations, and would maintain momentum that could prevent German forces from establishing another defensive line. Speed was valuable not just militarily but politically, as it would allow Western Allied forces to occupy as much of Germany as possible before Soviet forces arrived from the east. But Churchill had also been thinking about the post-war implications of how the Rhine crossing would be remembered and portrayed, about whether it would be seen as a British-led operation or an American achievement, and about how credit and glory would be distributed in the histories that would be written after victory was achieved. This was not merely vanity or concern for historical reputation, though Churchill certainly cared about both, but political calculation about how Britain's role in the war would be perceived by its own public and by the international community, and whether Britain would be able to maintain great power status in a post-war world increasingly dominated by the United States and Soviet Union. The Prime Minister had also been conscious of domestic political considerations that complicated his response. Churchill had led Britain through its darkest hours, had rallied the nation when invasion seemed imminent and defeat inevitable, but he was also facing criticism from within his own government and from the opposition about the costs of the war and about whether British interests were being adequately protected in negotiations with the Americans and Soviets about post-war arrangements. Any appearance of British commanders being upstaged or marginalized by American forces would feed these criticisms and would make it harder for Churchill to maintain public support for his leadership and his strategic vision. As dawn had begun to break over London and the city above started waking to another day of rationing and queues and the grinding exhaustion of a war that was clearly being won but was not yet finished, Churchill had made his decision about how to handle Patton's Rhine crossing. He would not publicly criticize or condemn it, would not create a crisis that would damage the Atlantic Alliance or provide propaganda ammunition to German or Soviet observers, but he would also not enthusiastically embrace it as a brilliant achievement. Instead, he would adopt a tone of measured approval that acknowledged the tactical success while gently emphasizing the importance of coordination and proper procedure in coalition operations. The statement Churchill had drafted for release to the press and for communication to Allied commanders had been characteristically carefully worded. He had congratulated Third Army on their successful crossing of the Rhine, had noted that this achievement demonstrated the skill and courage of American forces, but had also emphasized that it was part of a broader Allied offensive that included Montgomery's meticulously planned Operation Plunder and that all Allied operations were coordinated under General Eisenhower's supreme command in pursuit of the common objective of defeating Nazi Germany. The statement had been designed to give everyone something, the Americans got acknowledgement of tactical success, Montgomery got reassurance that his operation remained significant, and the coalition command structure got reaffirmation of its authority and coordination function. Privately, in communications with Eisenhower and with his own military chiefs, Churchill had been more direct about his concerns. He had made clear that while he appreciated the military value of Patton's crossing, he expected that Supreme Headquarters would ensure better coordination in future operations and would make clear to American field commanders that coalition warfare required consultation and notification even when speed and surprise were important tactical considerations. He had also asked for reassurance that Montgomery's Operation Plunder would receive adequate support and publicity when it was launched, that it would not be treated as an afterthought or redundant operation simply because Patton had crossed first. The relationship between Churchill and Montgomery added another layer of complexity to the Prime Minister's reaction. Monty was difficult, egotistical, and often maddeningly cautious, but he was also British, was competent, and represented British military leadership at a time when Churchill desperately needed visible symbols of British contribution and capability. Churchill had spent considerable effort defending Montgomery against American criticism, had protected him when the Battle of the Bulge had raised questions about his command decisions, and had insisted on maintaining Montgomery in a prominent command role even as American forces grew to dominate the Allied order of battle. Patton's Rhine crossing had made that defense more difficult because it provided concrete example of what American commanders argued generally, that British excessive caution and preparation led to missed opportunities, that American operational tempo and aggressive exploitation of success achieved better results with fewer resources, and that coalition command structures that gave Montgomery significant authority were constraining American effectiveness and prolonging the war. Churchill knew these arguments were oversimplified and ignored important differences between British and American strategic cultures and resource bases, but he also knew they were not entirely wrong, and that defending Montgomery's approach against Patton's achievement would require more sophisticated arguments than simple assertion of British command prerogatives. When Montgomery had finally learned of Patton's crossing, his reaction had been exactly what Churchill had anticipated: outraged complaints about lack of coordination, suggestions that Patton was endangering Allied operations through reckless disregard of proper procedure, and demands that Supreme Headquarters enforce better discipline on American field commanders. Churchill had listened to Montgomery's complaints with sympathy but had gently deflected his demands for punitive action, had reminded him that coalition warfare required accommodation of different command styles and national approaches, and had encouraged him to focus on ensuring that Operation Plunder was equally successful rather than dwelling on Patton's achievement. The conversation with Montgomery had been exhausting, requiring Churchill to play therapist and strategist simultaneously, to stroke the field marshal's ego while also getting him to accept realities that he found personally and professionally offensive. Churchill had emphasized that Patton's crossing actually increased pressure on German forces and would make Montgomery's operation easier by forcing the Germans to divide their attention and resources, that the two crossings were complementary rather than competitive, and that history would remember both as part of the broader Allied success rather than as rival achievements. This had been partially successful as consolation, but Montgomery had remained bitter about what he saw as American grandstanding and lack of proper military discipline, and Churchill had known that the incident would remain a source of resentment that would complicate future coalition operations and negotiations about command authority. The Prime Minister had made mental note to discuss the broader issues with Eisenhower at the next opportunity, to try to establish clearer guidelines about operational coordination that would prevent similar incidents while also acknowledging American commanders' need for tactical flexibility. Churchill's public statements about Patton's Rhine crossing had been generous in acknowledging the achievement while carefully situating it within the broader context of Allied operations and coalition strategy. In Parliament and in communications with Roosevelt, Churchill had praised the courage and skill of American forces, had noted that rapid exploitation of success was crucial to maintaining momentum against German defenses, and had expressed confidence that the Rhine crossing marked the beginning of the final campaign that would bring the war in Europe to a successful conclusion. These public statements had been crafted to maintain Allied unity and public morale while avoiding the kind of effusive praise that would have made it appear Churchill was more impressed with American operations than with British contributions. What Churchill had really thought, beneath the diplomatic language and political calculation, had been more complex and conflicted than any public statement could capture. He had admired Patton's boldness and tactical skill while deploring his disregard for coalition coordination. He had been pleased that Allied forces were across the Rhine ahead of schedule while concerned about what this meant for British influence over Allied strategy. He had been impressed by American military capability while worried about post-war implications of growing American dominance. He had wanted to celebrate the achievement while needing to protect Montgomery's reputation and British command authority. These contradictions reflected the fundamental tension in Churchill's strategic position in 1945, leading a nation that had fought longer and sacrificed more than any other Western power but that was being overtaken by American resources and Soviet military success, trying to maintain British influence over decisions that would shape the post-war world while increasingly dependent on American support and cooperation, wanting to be generous in acknowledging Allied achievements while protecting British interests and prestige. The Rhine crossing had crystallized all of these tensions in a single dramatic event that required immediate response but whose implications would unfold over months and years to come. In his private diary, Churchill had written a more candid assessment than any he had shared publicly, noting that Patton's crossing had been a brilliant piece of opportunism that succeeds by ignoring the very coordination that makes such opportunities possible, and observing that, we must congratulate the Americans while ensuring they understand that wars are won by armies working together, not by individual commanders pursuing personal glory. This private reflection captured Churchill's essential view: genuine appreciation for tactical success combined with concern about the broader implications for coalition warfare and Anglo-American relations. The incident had also prompted Churchill to reflect more broadly on the evolution of the Anglo-American alliance over the course of the war, how the relationship had shifted from British experience and leadership guiding American enthusiasm and resources in 1942 to 43 to American dominance increasingly shaping Allied strategy and operations in 1944 to 45. The Rhine crossing had been a symbolic moment in this transition, an illustration that American commanders now had the confidence and capability to act independently and that British authority over Allied operations was becoming more nominal than real. Churchill had understood that this transition was inevitable given the material realities of American industrial capacity and manpower, but he had hoped to manage it more gradually and to preserve more British influence over crucial decisions than seemed likely after Patton's demonstration of American operational independence. The Prime Minister had spent considerable effort trying to maintain the appearance and to some degree the reality of Anglo-American parity in command and decision-making, but events like the Rhine crossing made clear that this was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. The final irony that Churchill had appreciated, though it had brought him no pleasure, was that Patton's success in crossing the Rhine would make it harder to restrain American operational independence in future operations, that the very success of the crossing would be used by American commanders as justification for greater autonomy from coalition command structures, and that Churchill's own generous public praise of the achievement would make it difficult for him to argue later for more stringent coordination requirements. The Prime Minister had essentially been forced to celebrate an action that undermined the command framework he had been working to maintain, and had done so because the alternatives, public criticism or sullen silence, would have been even more damaging to Allied unity and British interests. As the days following the Rhine crossing had unfolded, as Montgomery's Operation Plunder had proceeded with heavy casualties but ultimate success, as Allied forces had poured across the Rhine and begun the final advance into Germany, Churchill had maintained his public posture of unified Allied success while working behind the scenes to address the command and coordination issues the incident had revealed. His communications with Eisenhower had been frank about the need for better procedures, his discussions with Montgomery had focused on managing the field marshal's resentment, and his briefings to the War Cabinet had acknowledged both the military success and the political complications. In the broader sweep of World War II history, Patton's Rhine crossing would be remembered as a brilliant tactical achievement that demonstrated American military prowess and individual command initiative. Churchill's reaction would be recalled if at all as gracious acknowledgement of Allied success, with the complexity and calculation behind that reaction largely invisible to those not privy to the private communications and political maneuvering that had shaped the public response. The incident would be taught at military academies as an example of exploiting opportunities and maintaining operational tempo, with the coalition warfare complications treated as secondary considerations if mentioned at all. But for Churchill, sitting in the War Cabinet rooms in the pre-dawn hours of March 23, 1945, processing news of Patton's unauthorized crossing and calculating how to respond in ways that would protect British interests while maintaining Allied unity. The incident had been emblematic of the challenges and contradictions of coalition leadership in the final phase of the war. He had been forced to balance genuine military appreciation against political necessity, to celebrate American success while protecting British prestige, to maintain alliance unity while recognizing that the balance of power within that alliance was shifting irrevocably away from British influence. What Churchill really thought when Patton crossed the Rhine was that it was simultaneously a brilliant tactical achievement and a troubling symptom of American operational independence, a development to be celebrated publicly while its implications were managed privately, a success to be acknowledged generously while working to ensure that future operations maintained better coordination and respected coalition command structures. His reaction had been neither simple approval nor condemnation but a complex mixture of admiration, concern, calculation, and resignation that reflected both his personal understanding of military operations and his political understanding of coalition dynamics and British strategic interests. The Rhine crossing had been one moment among thousands that Churchill managed during the war, but it had concentrated in that single event many of the fundamental tensions and transitions that characterized the final year of the European conflict, the shift from British to American dominance, the tension between individual initiative and coalition coordination, the gap between public celebration and private concern, the challenge of maintaining alliance unity while protecting national interests. Churchill had navigated these tensions with the skill and complexity that had made him one of history's great war leaders, but he had also understood that he was managing decline as much as victory, that British influence was waning even as Allied success was assured, and that events like Patton's Rhine crossing marked stages in a transition that would reshape the post-war world in ways that Britain could influence but no longer control. No public records capture the full complexity of Churchill's thoughts that night in the War Cabinet rooms. No official histories documented the calculations and contradictions that shaped his response. Only fragments in private papers and carefully worded public statements preserved hints of what the Prime Minister really thought when Patton crossed the Rhine, and those fragments suggested a man balancing multiple competing concerns with characteristic brilliance while recognizing that the world was changing in ways that even his considerable abilities could not fully direct or control. The illuminated map on the wall, with its blue pins and red ribbons marking the advance of Allied armies toward final victory, told a story of military success but concealed the political complexity and human calculation that shaped how that success was achieved and how its fruits would be distributed in the peace that was coming.